Good morning, team. We'll be starting in the next 1 minute. Kindly bear with us. One of the panelists hasn't logged in. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, good morning. My name is Dr. Thuranira Kaugiria from the Kenyatta National Hospital. Welcome to our fourth series of COVID-19 and pregnancy. And today we are discussing the ongoing research work that has been happening in Kenya. We have 3 panelists, 3 speakers. One of them is yet to log in, but we'll start today. Lois is engaged in another activity, so Dr. Mary Beth will be our chair, and Dr. Mary Beth, you can take over. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Friday webinar that's dedicated to COVID-related work and updates. Today is we are continuing our COVID-19 and pregnancy series, as Dr. Thuranira has mentioned. And today we are really privileged to listen to original research that's currently happening in our country. So we have 3 panelists with very exciting presentations that they'll share with us their work around COVID-19 and pregnancy. And we can learn from this because the work is still ongoing. They can share with us what they have been doing. So to start us off, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Ruth Khadembu Lusinde. She's a research medical officer who is based at the KEMRI Wellcome Trust Research Program. Welcome, Ruth, to share with us your work that's relevant to this series today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. I'll just quickly share my screen. Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you can see my presentation, and I'll be looking at the chat in case there's a problem to work on it. But as Dr. Maritim had mentioned, my name is Dr. Ruth Lusinde. I'm a research medical officer working with the KEMRI Wellcome Trust Research Program in Kilifi, specifically the Department of Epidemiology and Demography. So my day-to-day work involves coordinating some of our studies and trials, and relevant to this presentation is the work that we've been doing amongst ANC mothers in Kenya. And I'll just go into it because I'll describe more of it as we go on with the presentation. So before we start, I thought it would be nice to just give a background of what serological surveillance is for anyone who may not be sure. So serological surveillance is what we as epidemiologists consider the gold standard for measuring population immunity, mostly for after vaccinations, but also in case of infectious disease outbreaks. And this involves the estimation of antibody prevalence against a specific infectious disease. So it could be, for example, through repeated cross-sectional surveys, what we call serosurveys of a targeted population, but also just resampling the same population or persons to measure their immunity. So an ideal study is one where we would be able to sample a nationally representative sample. So maybe pick from the census a random sample of households, collect some blood samples from them and then check for antibodies. But this is usually very hard, just logistically, practically. And so what we do is we find other ways to get this data. We have areas that have well-defined health demographic surveillance systems, like in Kilifi, we have a DSS. There's one in Kisumu, there's one in Nairobi. So we could do something like this in such DSS areas. But also where this is not possible, we can still do serosurveillance amongst targeted groups. And this is part of the work that we've been doing. The relevance of serological surveillance in a pandemic like the COVID-19 pandemic, it cannot be, said enough. But early on during the pandemic, we used serological surveillance to check the trends of exposure to the virus over time. You remember at this time we didn't have the vaccine, so we didn't know what we were measuring. We weren't measuring immunity against any vaccine for COVID. And we also had limited testing capacity. So if not everyone is being tested, another way to know how many people have been exposed is by checking for antibodies against the agent in their blood. But also, as we go on, as the pandemic progresses, serosurveillance will be very important and is very relevant in evaluating the impact of COVID-19 vaccination programs, informing immunization policy. And I'll talk about some of these things later. We've been able to use serological surveillance to describe exposure among select groups. And, when I briefly mentioned work amongst healthcare workers, we'll see that we can, using serological surveillance, you can describe exposure amongst healthcare workers and then also pick out amongst this group which kind of healthcare workers is more at risk. Or, when we describe exposure amongst truck drivers, are they more at risk compared to, say, teachers, for example? And finally, these results are very important in disease modeling. So a lot of the response to the pandemic early on has been because of modeling data and a little bit of data from these studies, but it's still very relevant. That's a summary of what serological surveillance is. The work I'll present today is just part of a larger group of activities that we've been conducting at the program to aid the Kenyan government on the national COVID-19 response. And so early on during the pandemic, it was very important for the ministry and for our leaders to get a good picture with good data on what's going on in the country. And they approached us to collaborate with them in a series of surveillance work for COVID-19. We identified some hospital-based sites which we've been collecting data from, but some of our data is also collected in non-hospital sites. But the sites I want to quickly mention are Kenyatta National Hospital, Kilifi County Hospital, Busia County Referral Hospital, and the Aga Khan University Hospital. But also we have 21 facilities, so 21 hospitals across the country that form a clinical information network that has been working with some of our colleagues, and they've also come on board to help us with this work. So we are working with a lot of facilities. And the work we're doing it's a lot. We had to bring in a lot of partners. We've gotten a lot of support. Early on, we had to form a team of over 100 people working across the work streams. So this just means people who are conceptualizing the study, managing the data, the people on the ground collecting the data, and obviously our lab team who are running these samples for us. But I'd also like to mention that we've also had a lot of support from the Presidential Policy and Strategy Unit, and of course the Public Health Emergency Operations Center in linking us up with the county governments and getting their buy-in as we started this work, and obviously the labs that have been processing the samples from the non-Kilifi sites. We sought ethical approval for this study from various IRBs. So this is the KNH-UoN ERC, we have the Aga Khan Hospitals ERC, and for KEMRI, we have CERU, but also nationally from NACOSTI. And we regularly share updates with these IRBs on what's going on in the study. So I'll dive into the rest of it. When we set out to do these studies, our overall objective was to evaluate the demographic and clinical characteristics, the effects on health service, the seroepidemiology, the genomic and molecular mechanisms of COVID-19 in Kenya. And this was to inform national and county level response to the pandemic. But also just scientifically to help us understand more about this new virus and this disease in our setting. And our primary objective was to estimate the burden of COVID-19 in Kenya and the prevalence of exposure to SARS-CoV-2 amongst targeted populations in Kenya. This slide just shows a summary of some of the work streams, some of the work we're doing. I say some because it doesn't include the molecular and genomic work or some of the qualitative work we're doing on the effects of the pandemic on health systems. So at the very top, we have hospitalization. We have some work on hospitalized children and adults, so those who are suspected or confirmed to have COVID-19. And then below we have the work that we're doing in the Kilifi HDSS. So it's a demographics surveillance system. And then we also have work which is being conducted in Nairobi amongst PCR positive. So this is the asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic SARS-CoV-2 infected individuals, and the symptomatic infected individuals, the ones who've been admitted to Kenyatta National Hospital or Aga Khan University Hospital. I left these three to be mentioned together. So the work amongst healthcare workers, non-healthcare frontline workers, and ANC clients, because some of them have been going on concurrently. The samples we collect for the mothers at the ANC clinics is usually done at the same time with the healthcare workers. And during the presentation, you'll hear me comparing results from these two work streams. But we also have the work amongst the non-healthcare frontline workers. This just means truck drivers, teachers, people working at border posts. So people who were considered frontline workers early on during the pandemic and were thought to be at a higher risk for infection. And this is just a summary of what we've said. So we started on with work amongst blood donors, but then later on we quickly started the work streams in other groups. So the healthcare workers and ANC clients in Kenyatta, and then we have the frontline workers. We started with Busia, and now we are also in Kilifi, Mombasa, and Kisumu. And then there's a work amongst DSS residents in Kilifi and the PCR positives in Nairobi. So as I said, in collaboration with KNH and Aga Khan University Hospital. So now for the work stream that's relevant to this presentation. When we were conceptualizing these studies and this work that we wanted to do, the first thing you think about is, where are we going to get a group of people who can give us an unbiased sample of the communities where they come from? And is this group of people able to give us, blood samples where we can do our tests? And ANC mothers were a group that, fit this criteria. Because all mothers who attend ANC clinic for the first time are usually required to provide a baseline blood draw, the one we use for a baseline panel that will be used to follow them up. So it meant that if we were able to get residual samples from this group, then we could quickly test them for these antibodies. But also, as I said, they provide a relatively unbiased sample of the communities which they come from. So we aimed to include all women who attended ANC clinics for the first time at the study sites and who provided a routine sample. I say this because there are some mothers who prefer to provide, to get a sample collected at a different facility and then they come with the results. We didn't ask for samples from these mothers, and there's people who have contraindications to venipuncture, so we didn't include some of these mothers. We also did include mothers who are coming for follow-up visits, just because they're not required to provide a sample, so we don't have a residual sample to use. But also they're frequently coming to the facility. They've been frequently coming to the facilities, so they're also coming into contact with other people who may have been infected. We calculated a sample size for the study early on, and we were able to find that with at least 135 samples, per month from each site, we would be able to estimate the seroprevalence with a 3 to 7% precision. However, we've been aiming to collect up to 300 samples at each site. So what this means for us is that we repeatedly collect samples. So this is repeat cross-sectional sampling of new mothers attending ANC clinics at Kilifi County Hospital, Kenyatta National Hospital, and Busia County Referral Hospital. We do this every 4 to 6 months. And as I said, we aim to collect up to 300 samples per site, which translates to a data collection period of about 4 to 8 weeks. These residual samples are tested for antibodies against SARS-CoV-2 using a validated IgG ELISA for SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. And the specificity for this is 99%. The sensitivity for this ELISA is 93%. But another thing we also collect is the basic sociodemographic data for these mothers. So their age, which trimester they're in, if they've had any symptoms for COVID-19, and this is using the MOH surveillance form. But we also collect some data on where they've come from. So they are county and sub-county of residence. With this slide, I wanted to show us the flow of sample collection. So we have the teams at the ground which identify eligible mothers at the clinics. They collect sociodemographic data from these mothers, and this I described earlier. We get the residual sample stored and transported to the respective labs. So for the Nairobi and Busia samples, they're transported to the IPR and Kemri Alupe labs, and for the Kilifi samples, they come directly to our laboratories. At the lab stage, you remember at the beginning I mentioned we have a lot of studies, and each study would want to do something different with each sample. So we have the molecular work and the genomics work. This is the work which, these are the work streams that would now require PBMCs and pellets. But for the ANC work stream, we only require plasma. So at the labs, we separate the blood into these components. We use an in-house ELISA that I'd mentioned, and it's been described by our colleagues in this paper. And we QC this process with a COVID-19 convalescent plasma panel, which we got from the NIBC. So a summary of what we've been doing or what we've done so far is at Kenyatta National Hospital. This was our first site. We collected samples between 30th July and 25th August 2020. And then we had a second round where we collected samples between January and February 2021. And we are currently collecting samples for the third round. We had hoped to collect these samples earlier, but you remember we had the nurses strike between November and February 2021. So this really influenced our capacity to collect samples. At Kilifi County Hospital, we started data collection amongst ANC mothers in late 2020. So this is between 18th September and 30th November 2020. Of course, with the nurses strike, it meant the ANC clinic was not working, so we had to pause collecting samples. and we restarted in March 2021. So what's important about the samples we collect from Kilifi is that they've been collected continuously. So you'll notice for Kenyatta and for Busia, we collect them for a period of about 4 to 8 weeks, and then we resample later. For Kilifi, it's been an ongoing process, and we've not completed analyzing results for Kilifi, but later on we'll see that these results will be able to give us a good trend, from March to October on the seroprevalence. For Busia, we started late, so we started early. We started on with healthcare workers in late 2020, and then we started the ANC work stream in early 2021. So this is between April and May 2021, and we are currently collecting the second round of samples in Busia. So the results I'll present are mostly for the Kenyatta National Hospital. We still have, I'll also present some brief results for Kilifi County Hospital and Busia County Teaching and Referral Hospital. But I'd like to apologize for not including more results for these two sites, just because we haven't finished looking at the metadata for this. So for Kenyatta National Hospital, for the first phase, which was in between 30th July and 25th August 2020, the crude zero prevalence, so positivity was 46.4%, and the adjusted one was 49.9%, which is about 50%. And there's no difference, it's not a large difference of adjusted seroprevalence by age, trimester, whether there were any symptoms in the last month, the population density of where the mother comes from. So you remember I'd said we collect data on the sub-county from which the mother came from, and then using data from the national census, we know the population density of that specific sub-county. So there's no difference by this or even by sub-county of residence. When we were early on during the presentation, I mentioned that we collect samples from healthcare workers and ANC mothers at the same time. So during this same period, we're collecting samples from healthcare workers, and the seroprevalence at this point was 42%. That's at Kenyatta National Hospital. And early on, we had the samples that are collected from blood donors, which is just about this one, which was 5% between May and June 2020 and 9% around this period. So the seroprevalence for the mothers, the ANC mothers, was very close to that of the healthcare workers, so for 50% to 42%. Then we came to the second round. This is January to March 2021. We collected samples from a new group of mothers. So, and I think I'd mentioned this earlier, for the ANC study, we are sampling new mothers attending. So it's not the same mothers we sampled at this period. This is a new group. And for this new group, the seroprevalence was 30.2%. Adjusted one was 32.1%. And again, you see there's no big difference across the these groups. It's almost similar. But at this stage also, we collected samples for Kilifi, and later on we had the samples for Busia, and I'll mention this on the next slide. So for Kilifi, we collected the first samples between September and November 2021, so through the whole 3 months. Samples collected in September had an adjusted seroprevalence of 1.3%, which was very, very low. In October, this slightly came higher to 1.5%. And then by November, this was coming up to 11%. Of course, we remember that early on during the pandemic, a lot of the case burden was around Nairobi and its environs. And this would explain why we had a higher seroprevalence in Nairobi at that time compared to Kilifi in September, where the seroprevalence was 1.3%. But there's also a lot of factors you have to consider, like population density in Nairobi compared to Kilifi, and other things which we'll discuss in my discussion. So just to note that unlike Nairobi, where the seroprevalence was very high, almost half, 50%, in Kilifi it was very low in late 2020. In Busia, I mentioned the first phase between April and May 2021, and the seroprevalence seropositivity was 28.9%. So almost similar to KNH at a few months earlier, but still lower. With these slides, I wanted us to see a trend. So what we talked about, the importance of, serosurveillance studies and monitoring the trend of exposure. This is what we've been able to show through all of our studies. So the first work stream that started collecting data was the blood donors. And at this point, this is very early on during the pandemic, April, May, June 2020. The seropositivity was 5%. By the time we were collecting samples from ANC mothers in Nairobi and healthcare workers in Nairobi, the seropositivity was 50% for our mothers. At this time, it was 23% from the samples collected from blood donors. And then later on, we now collected samples from truck drivers in Busia and Kilifi, so 46% and 36%. At this point, we initiated the Kilifi site, so we started collecting samples from Kilifi healthcare workers and ANC mothers. And then this is now later on, and in early 2020, we now collected samples from ANC mothers again in Nairobi, and then healthcare workers in Kilifi, in Busia, and ANC mothers in Nairobi, in Busia and Kilifi. Unfortunately, I have not put those results here. And the latest results are these ones from the blood donors from mid-2021, so April to May 2021, where we have a seroprevalence of 63%. So we started here, and this is where we are now. In terms of the results I've presented, and I'm just going to try to be brief so that I don't eat into the time for my co-panelists, is that the results from our mothers give us a picture of community spread from a relatively unbiased sample compared to healthcare workers and other groups like truck drivers. And what I mean by this is healthcare workers have a higher risk of getting infected because of, they're working in hospitals. Many people who get infected will come to hospitals, so they have a higher risk. People like truck drivers who are moving across towns also have a higher risk compared to normal people, residents of those areas. And then even if you think about people like teachers or people who are working at border posts, they come into contact with different groups of people. So we could say that they have a higher risk, but the ANC mothers give us a picture of exposure in those communities where they live. So it's a very good group to analyze data from. And if we start with Kenyatta, the seroprevalence for phase 2 was lower than that of phase 1. I mentioned phase 1 results were similar to those of healthcare workers, but they were slightly higher than the blood donor ones. A possible explanation for this is, first and foremost, we said we are sampling different mothers at each time point. Early on during the pandemic, we had a high case burden in Nairobi, and it could be that by the time we were sampling these pregnant women in KNH, then very likely a lot of people in their communities had been exposed to COVID-19, such that 50% of the mothers who we sampled had antibodies towards COVID-19. By the time we were sampling the second group of mothers in Kenyatta, and this is early 2021, this is a new group of mothers. The first thing I think about is, if these mothers were coming from the same community as the first group of mothers, could it be that they were also exposed earlier? And now the lower seroprevalence we're seeing is because of antibody waning. But the other thing could be possibly, if they're not coming from the same places, then the exposure at that time point was much lower. But then if we look at results from other work streams at around the same time point, so this is early 2020, they're also the same. So, 34% for the Nairobi survey, for healthcare workers in Nairobi, it was also 30%, which is almost similar to the NC mothers. and then work from healthcare workers in Busia and Kilifi. It's in keeping with what we are seeing. The other thing that we could possibly try to think would be contributing to these results is we don't know much about antibodies that are formed after natural infection that's not symptomatic. So it could be that these mothers who have now come as pregnant mothers during the second phase may have been exposed, but their bodies had not formed enough antibodies for us to pick, or those antibodies had waned, especially if their infection was asymptomatic. In Kilifi, the seroprevalence has been gradually increasing, and this is what I'd mentioned about the Kilifi results, the way they're able to show us a trend. So we started from 1.3% in September, which went up to 1.5% in October, which then comes up to 11% in November. Unfortunately, because of the healthcare worker strike, we weren't able to see what happened in December and January and February, but we have the results for March to October, and maybe later on we can come back and present those. But with Kilifi, we see an increasing trend in seroprevalence. So if we think about the case burden as the pandemic has been progressing in Kenya, early on we had more cases in the urban areas and urban towns, and then later on during the year, this transmission was now more in the what you call rural counties like Kilifi or say like Busia. So it would explain why this prevalence has been gradually increasing in a site like Kilifi. And then for Busia, the phase 1 seroprevalence was 28%. Of course, we don't have results for the second phase, but this was lower than Nairobi at the same time point. Nairobi's was at 30. But what I wanted to mention at this point is that the serosurveillance for healthcare workers in Busia at the same time point was 61%. So 61% of their healthcare workers had been exposed to their virus-informed antibodies, but only 28% of the mothers coming to the clinic. So again, it just solidifies our thinking where we say that healthcare workers are more at risk, and it could be that spread in the community in Busia had not extended, was not as much by then. So it would be very good to see what our results for Busia for this final phase will be. But it's also important to remember that, as I said, these samples are of different mothers at different time points. So we can't really compare them directly. We've talked about the role of antibody winning in these results, but the other thing that would also affect the results we'll see in our third phase of data collection is vaccination. So by the time we're collecting samples for the second phase, the vaccines had just been made available in the country, but now we have a lot more people who've been vaccinated. So there'll be the role of natural immunity in the results we're seeing, but also antibodies from people who've been vaccinated from vaccinated against COVID-19. The main limitation for our work, the ANC study, is that we are sampling new mothers at each time point. Like it would have been valuable. So with the healthcare worker work stream, we sample the same cohort of healthcare workers at different time points, meaning we're able to see for those who are, say, seroprevalent at the first phase, how many of them are still seroprevalent at the second phase, how many were negative at the beginning and now are positive. And that gives us a better understanding. But with this ANC work stream, we only collect samples from new mothers at those specific time points. So it's good because it gives us a picture of seroprevalence during that period for that specific group, but not over a long period of time. And so the next steps for our study is that we aim to complete analysis for this final round of data collection. It would be very interesting to see the results for Kilifi, which would be a trend over time. But we also want to publish our results pretty quick. We have a preprint out, but we want to publish them and, you know, see where our results tie in with results from other regions. Thank you. I'd like to stop there. These are our people on the ground. So this is the KNH team, Dr. Aweru, Dr. Sarah Agonda, and Mike Misheni. And this is our team from Kilifi County Hospital. Yeah, and so we'd like to thank you all and giving us this opportunity to present our work.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Ruth, for an excellent presentation. And we urge the audience to post your questions in the Q&A. We'll take all the questions at the end of the three presentations. So be looking out in the Q&A for questions that may already have been posted, and you can already be thinking around the responses to the questions. So let me introduce our next speaker. We are privileged to have Dr. Helen Barsosio, who is a senior research officer based at the Kemri Kisumu site. And she's going to be presenting to us her original work around malaria and COVID and pregnancy and how these impact on pregnancy outcomes. So welcome, Helen, and we are happy to have you on this session today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, KNH Webinar, for inviting me to share this work. I'm just checking if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen. We can hear you very well. Welcome.
All right, thank you very much. Today I'll be talking about malaria, COVID-19, and pregnancy, and it's work that we've done in Kemri Center for Global Health Research that's based in Kisumu, covering about 5 of the counties in Western Kenya. And I'll be piecing together independent research work because as malaria researchers, when the COVID-19 pandemic started, we stepped back a little bit to understand how malaria and COVID would interact, one, and number two, what we needed to include in our future malaria and pregnancy trials. And just to say that we mostly do malaria and pregnancy trials, so understanding that particular interaction in the first instance then informs our work moving forward from 2022. So looking at malaria risk factor for severe COVID-19 disease was a first study that's ongoing, and looking at placental dysfunction in malaria that we've seen in previous pregnancy trials and how that placental dysfunction appears in SARS-CoV-2 and how we need to model and or adjust our current and future trials in malaria and pregnancy. And starting with the first particular study, MALCO, is malaria a risk factor for severe COVID-19 disease, was the first question. We also wanted to know if co-infection with malaria may affect the rate of seroconversion or seroreversion that we see with SARS-CoV-2 infection, especially because we know the active malaria infection somewhat modulates the immune system. And we also wanted to know if the choice of the anti-malaria treatment that we use would alter disease progression in any way. And this was informed by some of the initial work and publications by one of our research group members, Julie Goodman, looking at malaria and parasitic tropical diseases as potential syndemics during the COVID-19 pandemic. So onto the disease severity component. This is what we know. We knew at the start of this particular study that the risk factors for severe COVID-19 disease would be people who are older adults, non-communicable diseases such as hypertension and diabetes. What we didn't know at the time is if infectious diseases would contribute to the severity of COVID-19 disease. But we didn't know if malaria could exacerbate or dampen the inflammatory responses associated with COVID-19 disease. So what do we know about immune responses, especially with regards to malaria? We know that in malaria endemic areas that we acquire malaria immunity throughout, from childhood to adulthood, and in pregnancy, specifically the placental malaria, that this immunity is acquired in subsequent pregnancies, that those without placental immunity are mostly polygravidas and cephalogravidas. And we know that because of acquired malaria immunity, that older children and adults in malaria endemic areas would have asymptomatic malaria. So they won't present with any symptoms, but they would have blood still circulating through particular parts. And what we also know is that these asymptomatic infections might induce hyperresponsiveness. And this is something that we've seen with malaria, and it's a concern that we've seen with vaccinations, especially when we vaccinate people who have existing malaria infection, that you see some sort of hyperresponsiveness. And this might then prevent the development of an adequate immune response to other infections, even such as COVID. What we don't know is if the hyperresponsiveness that we see with malaria, and especially hyperresponsiveness of the immune system, would it somehow impede the type of protection? Will it provide partial protection from severe COVID-19 disease? And that if it does reduce what we see as a cytokine storm resulting in inflammation, could that also be protected?
Helen, one kind request. Please speak closer to your microphone. The audience are struggling to hear you. So move closer to your microphone. They can hardly hear you.
Can I check if this is better?
Louder?
Can I check if this is better?
Yeah, that is definitely better. That is better.
Okay. Okay. So I'm just going to go back to the last slide to see if that helps. So looking at immune responses specifically with malaria. So this is what we know. We know that people who live in malaria endemic areas will have acquired malaria immunity over time, and especially growing on from childhood to adulthood. And in pregnancy, that in subsequent pregnancies, then you would see placental malaria immunity acquired. So we see that because of this acquired immunity, that all the children and adults would have a symptomatic infection, and that means they would have active circulating blood stage P-particular parasites. And what we also know from work that we've done in Western Kenya, that asymptomatic infections provide some sort of hyperresponsiveness or induce some sort of hyperresponsiveness, such that if you were to get an infection such as COVID-19 or vaccinated, that might induce some sort of hyperresponsiveness and provide a partial protection against that particular disease. What we don't know is if this hyperresponsiveness could help in some way, because it would provide partial protection against severe COVID-19, and especially if it reduces the risk of a cytokine storm resulting from hyperinflammation. So there might be an advantage to that regard, but it might be a positive protection where you have active malaria infection. But looking at the combination of this immunomodulation and disease severity, and looking at previous work that has looked at respiratory illnesses in both humans as well as in models, what we've seen is that malaria-induced immunomodulation is protective against respiratory disease. And we've seen that with children who are hospitalized in Western Kenya, so specifically in Siaya. And murine models have shown that, and in this particular murine model, we used what was used was an immunovirus to model RSV and respiratory syncytial virus. It's a common virus, it's seasonal, and we see it in Western Kenya. And what we see from this particular murine model, that malaria infection led to reduced clinical symptoms, but viral control was impaired, and instead we saw increased viral dissemination. Other things about malaria that complicates malaria in itself as a disease is there are other pathways that lead to severe disease in malaria in itself, that it is a procoagulation state, a procoagulant state in itself, and how that interacts with COVID-19 is we see thrombocytopenia as a feature of COVID-19 disease. And what we don't know is if the two of them combined would then result in worse outcomes. So this particular study, Malcolm, comes in with a lot of unknowns, looking at malaria and COVID-19, and it's been structured to see the direction of severity we would see with malaria infection. We'd also want to see the type of immune response, whether there's a seroconversion or seroreversion. And we also want to see if we treat our patients with different antimalarials, ranging from what we see as first line at the moment, for instance, in Homa Bay, where we see rotation of first-line antimalarials, including Paramax and others, and including those in the study, how that affects the rate of seroconversion. And what we've designed this as is a cohort study in one part, following up patients who are COVID-only negative, COVID-only positive, and malaria negative for the first 28 days, looking at how they're shedding their viruses, collecting samples at each time point to see how they develop antibodies over time, and if they will lose that, their antibodies at the end of the follow-up cycle, and also enrolling people who are both COVID positive and malaria positive, and also seeing the severity of disease using the flu probe. We've also included a long COVID follow-up component, 3 to 12 months, specifically just looking at how the COVID-acquired infection and immunity, if that is sustained or lost, and especially when you compare both the cohort and the COVID plus malaria group. So that's
Helen, the audience is struggling still to hear you. Are you using headphones? They're struggling to hear you.
Let me just see.
Seems to be an echo. It's like it's muffled up because there's some echo when you speak. It's like there's some echo which muffles the.
Is this better?
Yeah, it's better now. I can hear it clearly. Let me ask them to type in if they can hear you clearly as well.
This is better.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Continue. They'll be typing.
Okay. All right. Apologies for that. Would you like me to go back and start? Would that help?
I think the previous slide only.
Okay. Okay, so Malcolm will be designed as a cohort class with a nested trial component that's going to look at if malaria is a risk factor for severe COVID-19 disease, and if co-infection with malaria would somehow affect how the immune responses to COVID-19 occurs, and to see what choices of antimalarials that we end up using would somehow affect disease progression. And this is, we'll have a cohort of 708 individuals followed up for the first 28 days, in which we're collecting samples with each visit just to see how antibodies are acquired or lost during that particular period. And for those in the nested trial, combined with malaria, we compare them with the cohort component and also see if the acquired immunity somehow impeded immunity to COVID-19. And we have a long COVID follow-up component for 3 to 12 months as well, just to see if the acquired COVID-19 immunity sustained over a longer period of time or lost, and seeing if that's worse off in those in the nested malaria treatment component. So coming into malaria and pregnancy together with COVID-19, this is just a snapshot of how malaria interacts with malaria occurs in pregnancy and how it causes adverse birth outcomes. And specifically looking at the child outcomes component, that malaria is associated with birth outcomes such as stillbirth, preterm delivery, low birth weight, and much later congenital malaria associated with neonatal mortality. And the drivers of these adverse birth outcomes is thought to be driven from placental dysfunction. And malaria, just as malaria causes placental dysfunction, we also see that with COVID-19. What we don't know yet, and this is what subsequent work in 2022 will be exploring, is we don't know if the combination of malaria and COVID-19 infection would result in worse birth outcomes. We don't know if the pathway of placental dysfunction in malaria is truly similar. We postulate that it's similar. And we don't yet know if the full impact of malaria immunomodulation that we see, that is somehow protective of severe COVID-19 disease, would somehow reduce the impact of these adverse birth outcomes. But this is what we know about malaria in pregnancy. We know that malaria in pregnancy results in placental dysfunction, especially when you see increased placental inflammation, with infected IRBCs festering and blocking small blood vessels and hyperperitoneia. We know that in malaria in pregnancy that this placental dysfunction is responsible for adverse birth outcomes such as preterm birth especially. And we know that acquired placental immunity over time, especially in subsequent pregnancies, reduces the risk of adverse birth outcomes. And because of this, we know that those at highest risk are those who are either first time or second time mothers, so primary and secondary gravidate, and those who have lost their placental immunity, such as those who are HIV positive, so those who are immunosuppressed. So this is what we know so far about COVID-19 placental dysfunction. That it seems to behave the same way like malaria and like HIV, that SARS-CoV-2 also targets the endothelium, causing dysfunction. And we know that this works through the ACE2 viral receptor that is also that's used to invade the cells, resulting in endothelial dysfunction and cell death. We have data that shows that COVID-19 causes increases in interleukin-6 and interleukin-8, but it also induces significant increases in antiogenic factors such as angiopoietin-2, and this was significant in this particular unpublished work. And that this data suggests that COVID-19 in pregnancy, like malaria and HIV, could increase systemic inflammation in the context of pregnancy, and it could impair placental vasculature. And that in cases where we have inadequate L-arginine intake, and just to mention that L-arginine is important as a substrate for nitric oxide, and it has been associated with placental dysfunction where this is where there's malnutrition because of L-arginine. That we don't know if it worsens placental dysfunction and adverse birth outcomes, and this is work that is being explored specifically in malaria and pregnancy. And all of these data support an overarching hypothesis that placental endothelial and vascular dysfunction is a common pathway, and that future interventions looking at how to solve placental dysfunction in malaria in pregnancy should also consider COVID-19 as well, and especially where both of them exist during pregnancy. So looking at our future work, that COVID-19 infection and malaria in pregnancy could potentially worsen adverse birth outcomes, and they may be altered by existing immunity. So we don't know in what direction, and that some of the interventions that we're looking at in future will also include questions on COVID-19 for this particular reason, because we are concerned about the placental dysfunction we see in COVID-19 that mirrors that of malaria. I do not have any results to share at this particular time, but in conclusion, so this is what we are working with, that malaria and COVID-19 interact to impact the severity of COVID-19 disease, and it's either positive or negative, which we'll know at the end of Markov trial, that immunomodulation in malaria might be protective against severe disease, and we hope that could also extend in pregnancy, especially those living in malaria endemic areas, but it's mostly to peripheral malaria disease, and this doesn't speak to placental malaria. That immune hyperresponsiveness to acquired COVID-19 infection or vaccination in malaria infected people is a concern right here. That we could vaccinate you, for instance, with COVID-19 vaccines, but we don't know to what level that level of hyperresponsiveness reduces the efficacy of the vaccine in that particular individual. And it's also work that's being explored in a parallel stream. We also know that, so another consideration here is malaria and COVID-19 in pregnancy could exacerbate adverse birth outcomes, especially so in primary and secondary gravidate who do not have acquired placental immunity, and combined with reduced infection would make it worse for this particular group. And that interventions, especially malaria and pregnancy interventions that are looking at ways to stabilize endothelium, such as L-arginine supplementation, should also include COVID-19 in its panel of infectious diseases to study. I would like to acknowledge and thank our Kilifi team in CGHR, as well as the University of Toronto, who is supporting the L-arginine supplementation trial, as well as Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and Open Philanthropy and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who are the funders of this particular project. Thank you very much. And apologies for the
thank you so much, Helen, for the presentation. I think
I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. I think there were a lot of challenges, and from the chat box and the Q&A box, you can actually see a lot of people struggled with the audio listening to your talk. So We apologize for that technical hitch, which seemed that we were not able to resolve it up to the end of the presentation. So we're waiting for the third panelist to log in, but we'll embark on our question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A session, and then we'll have the panelists take up the questions. But I have a first question for Dr. Ruth, and this is really around her presentation and the impact of the seroprevalence that they are doing. And my question is around, because they're sampling the pregnant mothers only once, so they are looking at trends, because a mother will not be sampled again. And I'm just wondering, one of the questions we've been grappling with, which maybe their data cannot really help us, or she maybe have some insight around this, is how can we use their surveillance data to assess for reinfection? Because even as the modeling team, that has been one of the questions, and particularly even when you're talking about vaccinations and other preventive strategies, the big question is really around reinfection. But I don't know whether she has insights of, or maybe as a group they've thought around that, how their network.
You're up next.
Somebody please mute in the background. Okay. The question is really around how can we use their network to detect reinfections, because this would be important, particularly when we have a new variant, because we know that the fourth wave was driven mainly by the Delta variant. How then with longitudinal or prospective studies help us to detect reinfections, which is an important question, because if we have a new variant, then even people who had who had antibodies to prior serotypes may still get infected. So Ruth, this is a question for you. I don't know whether you've thought around this or you have some ideas around this.
Thanks, Dr. So just to quickly answer, our specific work stream, the NC work stream, may not answer this, but we have the work amongst healthcare workers and truck drivers where we sample the same group over and over again over a period of time. This may be relevant to what you're asking. And just quickly, just top of my head, for example, we sampled for the healthcare worker work stream, which I'm also involved in. We sampled healthcare workers at KNH between July and August 2021. The seroprevalence was 42%. The same group of people, the seroprevalence came to 36% by early 2021. And then out of these 46% who were positive during the first round, out of the 42% who were positive during the first round, only 46% of them remained positive during the second round. So you see, for example, with that, we already know that some of these ones who had a positive PCR test and a positive antibody test, which is this seroprevalence, their antibodies had waned such that during the second round, they were no longer seropositive. And then during this third round, we will still sample the same group. So at this point, if we find that someone who was positive during the first round, negative during the second round, and then again are positive during the third round, then we already think they've gotten a reinfection, or maybe this could be because of the vaccine, because right now, most of our healthcare workers have been vaccinated. So maybe this, but also because the same thing is being done with truck drivers, where we are sampling them repeatedly over a period of time, and we are tying in the results we see from the seroprevalence with their PCR tests. So this may be able to answer what you say. I hope this answers you.
It does answer the question. Yeah, it answers the question that I had. Let me read for you another question. This is by Norbert Peshu. And the question is, were all these mothers asymptomatic? And why did you not consider taking throat and nasal swabs?
Okay, thank you for the question to Professor. So Norbert is our colleague at Kilifi. So while it would have been a very useful addition to our study, we designed our serosurveillance work to be easy to roll out. So in terms of convenience and using the residual data, of course, because of research, having to collect the the extra samples means we have to include a lot of other procedures, which also has implications in terms of funding for reimbursement of these mothers, in terms of staffing for the people who are going to collect these samples. So it would have been very nice to collect these samples, I agree, but how we designed this study was that it was meant to be quickly, something that's easy to roll out that can give us some results. And you know, as the pandemic progresses, of course, we are not rigid on what we are doing. We may consider improving some of these work streams. Thank you.
Okay, so another question, again for you, Ruth. I'm glad the questions are coming in because it just shows a lot of, both talks were really good. So this is a question for you, Ruth. So considering that there are multiple partners in the study, and it's a question by Jean Gitau. She's asking that you have many partners that are supporting the study. So she'd like to know who is responsible for data security and storage for the project and who has access to the data. And this is because there's increasing concerns on data protection in Kenya. And so she's really keen to find out about this, who owns the data, who stores the data, who can access the data.
Thanks. That's a very, very good question, Jane. Thank you so much for bringing it up, because it also just means I get to educate everyone on research ethics. We all know in research data is very, very important. Who gets to see this sensitive data of our participants and who has access is very important. And so even as we're preparing our protocols and submitting them for ethical review, we really have to state what's going to happen to the data and who's going to have access to them. Specifically for these COVID-19 studies, our data is curated and managed by the Kemri Wellcome Trust in Kilifi. We have very good IT systems and data protection systems. In fact, a bare minimum for anyone who is working on any of our studies is they have to go through data protection training and get, a certificate for this. So our data is very safe here. We also have arrangements with some of our partners on what data they can have access to. And so, for example, if someone were later to come and request to do a secondary analysis of this data, it would have to be approved by all these ethical committees, but also we would only give them de-identified data. So as we collect samples for our participants, we have identifiers for them because of feeding back results, but we don't share this with anyone who wants to do any secondary analysis. And just as you mentioned correctly, we have a lot of partners and collaborators, but not all of them come in different ways. For example, FCRIMA and NIBSC were helping us with the sera and the plasmids that we use to prepare the spike protein for this ELISA. So theirs is purely for the lab aspect. We have partners who've been helping us in terms like the WHO Solidarity too. The protocol that we use, is what has been shared openly by them. So it doesn't mean that every single person who's partnered with us is going to get access to our participant data. I hope this answers you, Jane.
Yeah, it answers the question very well, because I think you've spoken to what extent the data is accessible to the different partners and their contribution in all this, and the fact that all this were captured in the ERC application, and you clearly showed as you applied to various ERCs and NACOSTING. So I'd like to give an opportunity for Dr. Nyukuri to ask his question. Dr. Nyukuri, you can unmute and ask your question directly. I don't know whether it's addressed to the first presenter or the second presenter, but go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Maritim. Actually, my question is addressed to this first presenter. I wanted to know if they are checking antibody levels, especially among the participants who are being followed up, just to see if they are going down or going up. And probably it may also help address the issue of infection because they may notice a spike in the antibody levels. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, could you just please repeat? I think I missed a part of it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well. Thanks.
All right. So I was interested in knowing if you are measuring antibody levels or you are determining whether is it a positive or negative test, or you know the titer levels, and especially among those groups that you are following up for a long time, because one, it will help us know if the immunity is waning over time, and two, if there's an infection, then probably you might notice a spike in the antibody levels that may help answer that question.
Okay, thanks. I've gotten it. So for these results that you're presenting, we're using an OD ratio, optical density ratio, so positive versus negative compared to the negative control. But with what we have, I'm sure we could get the titers, and this will also be helpful as we try and check for things like antibody waning. So for these groups, for example, the groups that were seropositive at the initial onset, we would be able to now check for their titers at the second phase and probably at the third phase. I can't comment much on that right now, but hopefully if I'm re-invited to give the final results for all other work streams, we can discuss that too. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Nkudi. I'd like to give an opportunity for Professor Omondi Ogutu to also weigh in on the discussion. Professor Ogutu? Prof. Omondi Ogutu?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Am I audible now?
Yes, very audible.
Thank you, Maritim, Dr. Maritim. Very good presentations, especially the first present of Ruth, the work on Cambry, malaria and COVID. Those are two big things which, as an obstetrician, is of concern. My interest would be, and maybe Ruth can enlighten us on this. We know that with the malaria and the supposed reduction in immunity in those who are in a malaria endemic area, and most of them also have got chronic anemia, which therefore have a play in the progress of the pregnancy. If that has got a direct effect on the ease of acquisition of the infection, and were they seeing increased seroprevalence in those women who have got anemia and also have got malaria? That's one. Two, did they look at the gestational age of the pregnancy to see whether was it more in the first, second, or mostly in the third trimester? And then the other important component of interest would be that it would have been very nice to have a look at those placenta, because we know that the process with which malaria affects the babies, other than the many other things of anemia and the others, is because malaria also causes inflammatory process, which we find in the placenta. And that inflammation, as we know with COVID, even now worsens the status of these patients. So was the severity of the malaria related to the seroprevalence which they were observing? Or was it that if they got a patient with malaria, it's just that you had the malaria, but they're not looking at the severity of the malaria to correlate it with what was now being observed as the ease of seroconversion and getting COVID? Thank you, Maritim.
Thanks, Prof. I think I can answer on the issue of gestational age of pregnancy, and maybe likely about anemia. But then Dr. Helen would be better placed to answer the malaria-related questions. So in terms of gestational age of pregnancy, I just want to quickly show you what we had on the prevalence the seroprevalence, sorry. And so I'd mentioned that for both phases in like Kenyatta National Hospital, the seroprevalence did not seem to vary by gestational age. Of course, there's a slight increase. So those who are in the third trimester had a 54.6% seroprevalence compared to, first trimester where it's 44.9 and 42.8. But if you look at the confidence intervals for this, they overlap. So it just means there's really no difference across these groups. Same here for the during the second phase, and this time it looks like the third trimester group had a lower adjusted seroprevalence. But then again, the confidence intervals overlap with this for the first two groups, so there's really not much of a difference. I'd like to also mention on anemia. You've brought up that did we check if this patients had anemia, from their HB's results and in the malaria blood slides done at their first visit. We didn't, and it would have been very nice to see, just because the results are there, the samples are there, and it could be what you'd call a limitation of the study design we had, such that we were really focused on just quickly getting as much results as we could with minimum disruptions, so from residual samples. But obviously, it would have been very, very nice to see, because the results are there. So we have these mothers who are seropositive. How was their HB when they came for that clinic visit? What were their markers? Did they have malaria? And hopefully, it would have even tied to what Dr. Helen and her team are working on. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Professor Gutu, for that question. As I had mentioned, for this particular study, we don't yet have results, but a couple of hypotheses that we have is that specifically in malaria and pregnancy, where there is active ongoing infection, for moms who are asymptomatic and showing asymptomatic malaria, meaning that in the past they had acquired infection, to peripheral placental, to peripheral P. falciparum malaria, that particular immunomodulation might be protected. Severe disease. It doesn't necessarily, but it might be protective.
Helen, kindly unmute.
Hello, sorry, I've been speaking to myself for the last 2 minutes. Sorry, I was saying thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Professor Gutu, for that particular question. I hope I'm audible enough. So to answer, to respond to the component, if the prevalence of COVID-19 would be less so in pregnant women, we don't have an answer to that question yet, as the trials have yet to start for this particular one, and we're pulling together data. I was hoping that the next presenter, Victor Akello, who has done work on SARS-CoV-2 and pregnancy in Western Kenya, would have been able to share his very early preliminary data. So apologies for that.
He has just logged in, so probably we'll give him a chance.
Okay, just maybe one question for Helen, and then we can have Victor make his presentation. And I think the first question was really, when do you expect some preliminary data that you can share with us? I know you are maybe embarking on starting the study now. When do you see the preliminary data? And then my second question is really around the population that you are studying. And we know clearly that the high risk for severe outcomes in malaria include certain patient groups. So the young children and the pregnant women living in endemic areas. Other than that, really, adult patients in endemic areas don't seem to have severe illness unless you have visitors or short-term visitors who are non-immune travelers to those endemic areas. And I'm just wondering, your study is longitudinal, we probably would be able to see maybe the pregnancy population would answer a lot of the impact of the interaction. But we know that in the general population, COVID is a disease mainly of the adult population. So I'm just wondering, what are some of the expectations around the rest of the people who maybe have the malaria infection but do not have severe outcomes that you intend to follow up in your second arm, which you said had, this is the arm that has the COVID-19 and the malaria. What are some of the expectations? And the other question linked to that is really from global epidemiology of COVID-19. We've seen Africa had been predicted to have very poor outcomes and more mortality, but this has not really been the case, and we have sort of been relatively spared of COVID-19, and I just pray that this continues to be the case. Can you then say, because we clearly know that malaria, we have a malaria-specific belt extending East Africa to all the way to West Africa, but we haven't seen a lot of these adverse outcomes. What are your thoughts around this?
Those are very good questions. So looking at, let me start with the first part, that for lack of a better word, we are assaulted with multiple infectious diseases over time. So from the time we are children onto adulthood, and specifically in Western Kenya or malaria endemic areas, malaria is added onto that. That this particular study, MALCOV, in which we don't yet have results until June next year, wonders if this frequent exposure to infectious diseases such as malaria may somewhat dampen the inflammatory responses that we see associated with COVID-19 disease. And University of Stanford will be looking specifically at the pathological pathways that result in this quote unquote dampening of the excessive inflammatory responses. That if you somehow dampen the excessive inflammatory responses such as a cytokine storm, then you wouldn't see as much severe disease as you would in people who had, I think there's a paper that was published by the group in Muhimbili University that showed that there has been cross-infection with other coronaviruses over time, and that this infection and acquired antibodies over time may provide some sort of cross-protection. But that work is also being explored. For the second part about the malaria and pregnancy work, in previous malaria and pregnancy trials, these have just been in Western Kenya, have included both primary gravidae as well as multigravidae. And we see, and what we've seen from this particular study is that there is excess severe disease, excess severe malaria disease, and excess adverse pregnancy outcomes, especially in primary gravidae and secondary gravidae. And that's explained by that lack of placental immunity that you acquire with subsequent pregnancies. I think if you remember a little bit of your microbiology, there are two subpopulations of the malaria parasite. There's a peripheral ones that bind to CD36, which is very common, the CD36 receptor. And then there's those that bind in the placenta, the chondroitin sulfate is in the placenta. And these different populations of malaria parasites, you need frequent exposure. So with subsequent pregnancies, you get acquired immunity. Our concern is especially the primary gravidas and the secondary gravidas, first and second time pregnancies, who have not acquired the placental immunity and then meet COVID during pregnancy. And the combined placental dysfunction from malaria plus COVID could then result in severe disease, specifically in this population that we are marking as very high risk for this particular group. We asked to extract data from trials that were ongoing since 2020. So once we have our data sharing agreements in place, we'll be able to look at this in more detail, especially looking at adverse birth outcomes like preterm birth for that particular population who we say have quote unquote lost or do not have sufficient placental immunity, as well as for the HIV positive people. So for this immunosuppressed group in Western Kenya, that the acquired immunity that you get over time is lost. And it's especially worse for a first-time pregnant mother is HIV positive and gets malaria, and then you add COVID on top of that in Western Kenya, we think might result in worse birth outcomes, but we don't have the data yet to back it up. If you do give us an opportunity, we'll be able to share, and I promise next time I'll be more audible. Thank you.
Actually, Helen, you've been so audible in the Q&A session. Thank you for that. And we'll invite you back here again to share with us your data once you've done the study. So thank you very much. Allow me to recognize the attendance of Dr. Lois Ombajo, who's actually the chair of this session. We are glad to have her back. She had a commitment early in the morning, but she's been able to join us. So welcome, Lois. We are going on with the sessions, and we have one more presenter who's logged in, and I hope he's ready to share with us his talk. So let me introduce Dr. Victor Akelo, who's a Senior Public Health Advisor with the US CDC Western Kenya. And he has a wealth of experience. He's currently the principal investigator of ANC-PNC COVID surveillance study that's called ANCOV study. And he's also the co-principal investigator of the Child Health and Mortality Prevention Surveillance, what's called the CHAMS program. So Dr. Victor, please welcome to share your findings or your study with us. We really look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Maritim, and my apology once again for the delay and keeping you guys waiting. The pathology, I'm in a pathology conference here in at the course, and we were presenting on the other study, CHAMS, which has gone a little bit over time, especially in the Q&A session. So once again, I apologize to the rest of the team for keeping you guys waiting. I'll try to move a bit fast so that I can try to save some time. So I apologize ahead of that. I'll share with you some of the early findings from the ANCOV study. ANCOV study is still ongoing, but we're beginning to look into what our data is telling us. I hope you can see my presentation. Please, can someone confirm and hear me well?
Yeah, we can see and hear you well.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I won't concentrate so much on the COVID. We do know there's over 2 million infections with several deaths that have occurred as a result of COVID-19. There is increasing, but still very minimal literature on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic in pregnant women, especially in our settings. And past studies have predicted some increased adverse outcomes such as miscarriages, stillbirths, severe maternal mortality, morbidity, preterm births, and etc. that I think I've just had Ellen and the rest of the team discuss. So we decided then to lay a sub-study within our MNH platform, maternal and newborn health platform, to try to conduct a surveillance among pregnant women and document the burden of COVID-19 in this in pregnancy and the resultant impact on adverse outcome. So we started enrolling from August 2020, and we've just completed the enrollment and following up the participants as at now. So a little bit background on this MNH platform. So the MNH platform is called Antenatal Postnatal Care Research Collective, which is one of the ARC sites in 5 of the 5 African countries and 2 Asian countries that was set up with the support of the Gates Foundation in response to several gaps, just as low ANC coverage and consistent quality of care, ANC-PNC care, and limited evidence on innovative service delivery approaches and how to effectively scale some of those poor continuity to care for women who received, for the women to receive the 4 ANC and now the 8 WHO contacts. And women in vulnerable population least likely to have their first ANC visit in first trimester, less available information on postnatal care, and fragmented data sets that limits the ability to advocate for policy change. So all these were part of the gaps that were identified to guide the formation of the Antenatal Postnatal Research Collective. The first protocol that we have been implementing on that platform is a protocol that is looking at the risk stratification among women using some harmonized data that could be able to help us understand risk factors, morbidity and mortality, and also to help inform innovative strategies that could be implemented within the platform to prevent poor adverse outcomes. So the layered approach to the MNH platform, we start with the lowest down there, which we do operate on health and demographic surveillance system. Probably Ellen has talked about it because we work in the same region. That HDSS platform has over 350,000 people in 3 areas, including an urban HDSS in Kisumu. And we layer different studies, including the child health mortality, the CHAMS on it. But today I will mostly concentrate on the one that I've highlighted in red, circles in red, the PRISMA, the UNCOV, and the DIVCOV, but more specifically about the UNCOV study, which is looking at the ANC-PNC COVID surveillance work. The primary aim of UNCOV was to estimate the burden of COVID-19 in pregnancy, newborn, and child, and evaluate the impact of COVID-19 on pregnancy with several secondary objectives, including impact on pre-existing conditions in pregnancy, risk of vertical transmission, document link between HIV and COVID-19, impact on COVID-19 on mortality, and evaluate the role of new tools such as ultrasound to bridge the gaps given the restrictions and the mitigations that have been placed as a result of COVID-19. The way the study works in terms of study flow, so we do have within that geographical catchment area, the community health volunteers, the health PDSS and other household members notify and identify these pregnant women that are then referred for eligibility screenings, and we are at preferred health facilities, their preferred health facilities, and in those particular facilities, we enroll them, have at least 4 ANC contacts and visits. There is IPC pregnancy outcome as another visit. And in the unfortunate event that there's a loss of a child, then they enroll in CHAMS if they do agree on consent to the same. And we are also starting another study on adult mortality, which will also be enrolling some of the pregnant women. The adult mortality, we do this in collaborations with the KNH and University of Nairobi, led by Dr. Walong. So we do COVID testing and symptomatic screening at each and every visit, the 4 ANC follow-up visit and at delivery, and also at postnatal and 6 months of age. The COVID-19 positive patients are managed according to the clinical management by MOH. So we work very closely with the various counties, in this case, Kisumu and Sierra County, to manage these cases, share the data, and ensure that follow-up or contact tracing are done accordingly. So the COVID-specific protocols, that additional work that we have added on the PRISMA protocol, of course, given that we are more likely to be dealing with COVID-19 infected participants, we increase PPE IPC measures. The SARS-CoV-2 testing, we do PCR and serology testing that is done at every ANC visit, delivery, and postnatal. The maternal samples collected include the blood, the NPOP, swab, saliva, sputum, breast milk, fecal swab, and urine. And then we also do collect quite a number of other samples on neonates. We do also collect additional enhanced samples in addition to the ANC PNC profile data, such as CBC, biochemistry, hepatitis B screening, THC, and these are actually more of the larger MNH protocol. So we continued them for this cohort of ANC of UNCOV participants. This slide just shows the visit schedules. We aim to enroll the pregnant women at less than 13 weeks with a window period of ±1, and then there is the second visit at 20 weeks, 28, 36, and then at birth, and then we do have those 4 additional visits that we conduct after delivery. The specific research data collections are done in conjunction. We try to make it as much as possible to coincide with the clinical visits, and if visits are missed, attempt is made to contact the mother so that they can be able to come to the facility. So some preliminary data. So far we have had in our notification system over 8,000 notifications. A number of them are not eligible. 80 of them are mostly from community health volunteers and the community health workers that are based within the community. The enrollment, this slide just shows you the enrollment. We have enrolled about 1,688 participants as at 31st of August. I think by the time we were ending the enrollment last month, that number had risen to about 1,900 pregnant women enrolled at different months, as you'll be able to see. Majority of these women are young women in the age of 20 to 35, and we do have about 10% of them that are teen pregnancy. We also do have close to about 60% of the enrolled women being either being primigravida or para-1 at the time of enrollment. A little bit, I wanted to share this a little bit on the HB, the anemia, especially in this particular cohort, the prevalence of about 35%, but most of it is mild anemia, and mild and moderate anemia. But we also, we do conduct the HB measurement using both IMAQ and CBC. And of course, we do, there's that debate that's out there between the two HB measurement, as you'll be able to see. In Western Kenya, we do have a background of 32 to 60% prevalence of anemia. So pregnancy and risk outcomes that we have so far witnessed, majority of the women in their past pregnancy, not the current one, for those that had past pregnancy, the spontaneous abortion, miscarriage, HIV and planned CS, low birth weights, and macrosomia are reported as some of the most prevalent conditions that were noted in the past pregnancy. But in the current pregnancy, close to about 11% of the women have HIV, and so far about 8% of the women have had planned and unplanned CS, malaria about 6%, and obstructed labor about 60%, and the rest, as you could be able to see on the slides. On a bit more on the COVID, so we do test COVID at enrollment, and you could see the distribution of the number that are testing positive during the follow-up. So majority of them tested positive at the entry, which is close to 50, but additional other women have been pregnant women have been testing positive for COVID-19 in those other visits. And then we have also had about 35 of our babies also testing positives during day 7, day 28, and quite a number on day 42, and a few on 6 months. We haven't had any baby that has reached 1 year of age as of now. This is just an attempt to try to show how the positivity rate, it's not smoothened, so apology for that, but it's essentially kind of following, for most part, the wave that we have seen in Kenya, with majority of the COVID positive pregnant women in Western Kenya that we enroll tested between, majority of them were between March and around July thereabout, which is when the current wave that we have it started. There, of course, there's discussions that Western Kenya quite never got out of the third wave before the introduction of the Delta variant. So we noted a lot of COVID positive women around that particular period. Majority of our women, about 45%, 55%, had some symptoms, and
Victor, you're breaking off. You're breaking off. Your internet is unstable.
Do you want me to check?
Restart this slide.
Sorry? Do you want me to go back to the previous slides?
No, the one with the next slide.
Okay, this one. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Okay. So sorry about that. And 45% have been asymptomatic, and most of the symptoms that they presented with are listed there. You could see cough, headache, anorexia, anosmia, fatigue, geosia. 14 of these mothers admitted in the health facility, but none of them has actually been put on oxygen or required ICU management of these 55 of these 117 pregnant women that have had some symptoms. And as I mentioned earlier, we have had about 213 pregnant women that have tested for now. This slide is an attempt to try to look at the crude association between adverse pregnancy outcome by COVID status. And you could, so far, what we are seeing in this particular slide is that there is no significant difference by when you compared some of these adverse outcomes so far as at now by COVID-19 status. But looking at a little bit much further, there's some that are emerging to show some significance, such as the very low birth weight, which we are seeing almost the women that have COVID are about 5 times more likely to have very low birth weight. And I think that goes along with the preterm births and the very preterm births are some of the things that we are seeing as more likely to be associated with COVID-19. Sorry, there's a bit of some noise on my background. So we continue to also track 19 vaccine, about 6 of them, and 4 after becoming pregnant. All have received AstraZeneca, and we continue to also lay other studies that monitor some of the safety profiles in these women. A number of the 55 child deaths that we have reported, we have enrolled a number of them also in the child health mortality to kind of take advantage of that platform, rigorous cause of death determination. And so far, we will be they haven't gone through the decoding process. But once that happens, then we'll also be able to show the cause of death for some of these children in a much more rigorous manner. So our next step, as I've mentioned, this is still an ongoing work, is to complete the follow-up of all enrolled participants that is expected by February 2022. Redo the analysis after the follow-up in terms of trying to look at the association between the COVID-19 and some of the adverse pregnancy outcome. Some of the questions that we're asking ourselves is that any adverse pregnancy outcome as a composite, we are seeing that as high as 30%. But if COVID is not driving it, then we need to answer. So we are working with the WHO to contribute this data as part of WHO piece of work. And also there's a group that is doing prospective meta-analysis that we are also contributing this data to for pool estimates. Other planned analysis, we haven't analyzed our SARS-CoV-2 serology data. Could it be that majority of these women had been exposed and as a result, maybe that could have obscured some of the association between the adverse pregnancy outcome and the COVID status that we are looking at. We are also looking at measures or markers of placental functions, such as genesis, vasculogenesis. So we are having some of this work that we are starting on with other collaborators, such as the University of Toronto. We also plan to conduct secondary analysis on vaccine uptakes in pregnancy and maternal and infant outcomes, and are also looking at pharmacovigilance of a COVID-19 vaccine within the demographic health surveillance system, including this particular cohort. So I think that is the brief summary of the kind of work that we are currently having, and I would wish to stop there and ask if there's any question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor, for that excellent work that you're doing around COVID in the peri-pregnancy period and using your existing demographic surveillance system. So it's really very exciting work. And I know before you joined in, there were some questions that had been asked by Professor Ogutu to the previous speaker, particularly to Helen, around the impact of COVID and pregnancy and outcomes, and anemia was inside there. Please just kindly allow me to invite Prof. I hope Prof is still online to ask the questions, because I think you have the answers he was looking for, because your presentation has actually highlighted some of those particular aspects he was keen to find out. Prof. Omondi Ogutu.
Thank you, MB. Mary, sorry, audible. Hello?
Audible,
Hello?
Prof. You're very audible. You're very
Okay.
audible.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very good presentation and covered some important areas. I'd address some issues which some of them you have looked at. I wanted for somebody to give us an input on effects of the COVID and the association between those with malaria in terms of the severity of the infection and its effect on the placental bed. And we know the relationship between the placental pathology, which is realized when people have got COVID disease, the inflammatory process. Malaria also has the same. So would the two be able, therefore, to make the infection much more injurious to the growing fetus? And then also the other thing was, could there be a correlation between anemia and also the severity of COVID disease? Because, you know, anemia and malaria are bedfellows. Did you, in your look at the correlation between the two? And therefore, if somebody has got malaria and anemic, and also are they more vulnerable to getting COVID-19 infection? And if they do, would it be the process and the injury to the fetus, would it be such that we are more likely to have increased fetal wastage, which we use that word because when you have a fetal loss, we talk of fetal wastage because there's no take-home baby. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Prof, for those questions. Actually, so some of the questions that you are raising are part of the analysis that we have planned up, and I'm sorry that I don't have that data with me right now. As I mentioned earlier, we are looking at the placenta inflammation, and then the interaction between malaria and COVID-19 as a study on its own. And we've delayed a bit, but we're supposed to start that work and ship some of those samples to University of Toronto to be able to look at some of those placenta inflammation. I think I did mention that. So hopefully we should be able to have some results by early next year on that particular piece of work. Of course, I do agree with you that in theory, I would imagine that COVID, malaria, and the total inflammation that on the placenta may be able to result into more fetal wastage. But again, just like you have mentioned, even for anemia as well. But these are some of the things that we have planned for analysis. I think we do have some analysis that is starting on anemia and malaria. I don't have anemia and severity of COVID-19. I don't have that data right now with me. But I would also say that we didn't see quite a number of very severe COVID-19 infections in our cohort of about 1,600, which is kind of intriguing given the data that we have seen, let's say from Ghana, put out by CDC. I do know there's a lot of background other conditions, HIV, malaria, and generally very high wastage, fetal wastage that we do have as high as 55 losses so far in a population of about 1,000 deliveries. So we want to carefully look at this and see what is it that is the major driver. One of my colleagues was wondering, maybe it could be that there could be, the fetal losses could be resulting from more thing in our setup than just COVID-19. But I'm looking forward to what our data will be telling us. Thanks. Over.
Thank you, Victor, for that additional comments and answers to Prof. I'm just wondering also, because your data was slightly different. This is one of several series we've had discussions around COVID-19 and pregnancy. And we clearly know that, and we've seen even in our setting, we've had a lot of, not really a lot, it's around maybe 2% mortality among the pregnant, case fatality rate around the pregnant mothers. But in your data, you didn't have adverse outcomes in terms of mortality. You had more around the fetal wastage, as Prof put it. And I'm just wondering, what are some of the drivers? And you've sort of alluded to this. And I know we've had in our previous webinars, we've looked at risk factors that are within their mothers and things including pre-existing diseases like hypertension, diabetes, maybe obesity, and also maybe the gestational age and trimester around the infection. And I wonder, maybe in your population, maybe also the inoculus or the infectious dose of the virus may contribute, because this clearly your population is probably more rural compared to maybe urban settings, Nairobi and the like. And I'm just wondering, maybe the household where the women get exposed and infected and things like that. And maybe one of the things to look at would even be, because you're doing nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal swabs, what would be, like, for example, the cycle threshold, for example, the viral loads for the positive mothers, because maybe that may be one of the things that influences, because clearly for SARS-CoV-2, the higher the infectious dose, it can shorten the rate of progression of illness. But a lot of these things changed when we had the Delta virus, and regardless, some people had poor outcomes. And clearly you've shown us that the third and fourth wave merged into each other. So most likely you have Delta variant already circulating within your population, but it's not clearly explained why your patients had a better survival compared to some of the patients that we discussed previously on this webinar.
Professor Maritim, were you done?
No, I'm not yet done. In our webinars, we've looked at individual patients.
Hello?
We've not. I'm still speaking. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Victor? Hello?
We can hear you, MB.
Yeah, but I think I'm not communicating with him. Victor, okay, answer the question up to that point.
Professor Maritim, can you hear me? So I think I lost you at some point, but I got most of your question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, my question, let me just finish it. I'll summarize it. It's around to explain the less severe maternal outcomes in your setting compared to other patients that we've seen in our setting within Nairobi. But although the data we have in Nairobi is around individual patients rather than population-based.
Yeah. It's actually very intriguing. I mean, you know, when we first did this analysis, and by the way, this is the first time that we tried looking into this data. When I was approached that we could share some of the highlights of what we may be seeing. So it makes me think that there's need to go further and interrogate the data even much more. So many things are running through my mind. You know, how does the high level of positivity or seropositivity plays in all this game, for example, because when the Delta variant was introduced in Kisumu, we had quite a number of infections, but then, you know, were these fast exposure, were they follow-up exposure? We have to analyze this, all these, and luckily enough, we do have serology samples that we can be able to try to look at some of these past infections, and if they may be able to give us some insight into this. I do agree with your point on the viral load for these positive mothers, because we do have that data in our lab. We will have to look at that also, if it could be able to explain this. The other thing that you're very right about is that I've always thought is majority of our women are from low socioeconomic status. You know, they are rural women and very different from what I've seen published. You know, could this have played a role? But if it did, then what is the mechanism of explaining this? Some of this. So in general, Prof, I'm also just saying that there's a lot more question that our data should be able to help bring out and contribute. Luckily enough, I think with over 200 infected pregnant women, the planned inflammatory work and the interrogation that we are planning to do, and the high number of enrolled participants, with including the enhanced testing such as the biochemistry, the CBCS, and etc. We will try to look into all this so that we could try to get the answer to that. So maybe we could, I think maybe by early next year, we could have another review and see what the data could be telling us. Sorry, that doesn't quite answer your questions, but it's kind of just add more to the question that you've raised.
No, but it's good discussion because it means you can explore your data and see how to find some of these answers, which only data can help us to find this unique presentation. So let me pose two more questions that have been asked by two members of our audience. So the first one is by Jean Gitao, and she's congratulating you for the brilliant work. And she wanted to know whether you're considering carrying out genomic sequencing on patients with severe symptoms or symptomatic disease. And this may be linked to the Malkov study. So that is the first question, whether you're doing additional genomic work, and you'll tell us that. Then the second question is by Dr. Barbara Mambo, and she's curious about the symptomatic clients, which you mentioned were around 50%, compared to what is usually reported by MOH, usually around 9% of the clients are symptomatic. So she wants to understand this difference, and could it be pregnancy related, or because the study was actively looking for the symptoms, so was eliciting the symptoms from the study participants? So those two questions.
Yes, thanks. Thanks so much for the two questions. Thanks, Jean, for your question. We do have some genomic data because some of our participant samples have been included in the sequencing that has been done in Western Kenya and shared also with the Kilifi Wellcome Trust. Though, of course, you know, there are criteria and eligibility on the samples that needs to get to the genetic sequencing. So those are things that we will need to bring on board and start to look at that as well. So thanks for raising that. The difference in the percent symptoms, those who have symptoms in this study compared to what we see in MOH, I have two perspectives. One, you know, I also do support COVID response in Western Kenya. And I do think that sometimes the symptoms that are reported in the national CITREP is a bit more of an underestimate, because when someone is diagnosed with COVID-19 and they don't have any symptoms as at that point, there's quite no follow-up to see if maybe a week thereafter or 2 weeks thereafter they develop symptoms, because I've seen some of those patients, you know, they start with almost no symptom at the time of diagnosis, and maybe because they're caught early as a result of contact tracing, but later on they develop some symptoms. So that could potentially be playing a role, or rather leading into missing of some of the symptoms that you pick up along the way. The second thing, I also do think it's pregnancy related, but the thing with the pregnancy related, it's kind of ironical in the sense that yes, you could say this because they're pregnant women, they may be more likely to develop symptoms. But then the question then that I ask myself is, we haven't seen so many of them have very severe disease to the extent of even, you know, we have almost like none of them that has been admitted in the ICU. So it's you know, it's again just raising more questions in terms of trying to understand what's going on within this particular population. Over.
Thank you so much. I think we've had a very excellent 2-hour session, and we are coming almost to the top of the hour. And we are going to be finishing in the next 3 or so minutes at exactly 12 noon. Just allow me to invite Dr. Lois just to greet us and say maybe a word or two to all of us. Lois? I know I've ambushed you.
Thank you, Dr. Maritim. And it's been such a fantastic session, at least the portion I managed to get. I think big congratulations to the teams that are doing really, really good work, and we look forward to them seeing more more data coming from people who are also, doing the research. Showing us what the data is saying about our patients. So we really appreciate that able to join and share some of your more. And again, thank you for the chance. Dr. Maritim, I'm done.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lois, for those kind words. And I have to echo your words that normally when we are making some of the decisions and policies, it's good to have our own local data to inform some of those processes. So it's really exciting today to have hosted research teams that are doing amazing work all over the country. And it's good to see that this work is being done in the entire breadth of Kenya. We've seen work done by the Kilifi team, but with research sites extending across the different parts, including Kenyatta and even counties in the western part of Kenya. And then we've also been, we are happy to hear the work from the western part of Kenya, where we have a higher burden of malaria and HIV, which can have an impact on COVID-19. So this has really, really been exciting. And this is has been part of our webinar series around COVID-19 and pregnancy. And thank you all for participating. There's a question that has been posed by Dr. Wambani, and this is around healthcare worker strikes and the impact. And I think this question or the impact of healthcare worker strikes may not really be fully answered in this forum, because we are the healthcare workers. Most often when people go on strike, it's because they are aggrieved and something has gone wrong and maybe mediation has failed, and therefore maybe you cannot fully discuss, but we clearly agree that that question really has an impact on the service delivery and medical research, but we cannot fully exhaust it in this forum today. But we'll be able maybe in future webinars to touch maybe around it. And then Victor is inviting people who have ideas and interest in supporting the planned analysis. They can contact him directly and share their thoughts and ideas and support the planned analysis with him. So you can get in touch with Dr. Victor Akelo for those of you who might be interested in supporting the planned analysis. So without much ado, let me thank all the panelists, maybe thank the panelists and invite them for a future date once they have additional data that they can share with us. This forum is willing to host you to share with us your data in future. And we really want to appreciate all the work that you are doing. Keep up the good work. And I also want to thank the host and all the other contributors to this session, Professor Omondi Ogutu, and all the other people who've contributed. Thank you so much. And we'll meet again. We'll announce when our next webinar is, most likely next week on Friday, to continue the series on COVID-19 in pregnancy series. Thank you so much. And that's the end of our session today. Thank you to all of you. Bye-bye.